Hello, and welcome to Epstein Becker Green's Telehealth Crash Course series. Today's crash course is the second of 3 sessions entitled 5 Factors to Consider When Choosing Initial and Expansion States for Your Telehealth Practice. Before we begin today's presentation, please be informed that today's webinar is being recorded and the participant phone lines will be placed on mute throughout the program. You're welcome to submit questions directly to the presenter following the webinar, and the contact information will be displayed at the end of the presentation. In approximately 2 to 3 business days following the webinar, Epstein Becker Green will communicate the availability of the webinar recording and access to the PowerPoint materials. We are pleased to have a fantastic speaker today, Bradley Davidson, who is an associate at Epstein Becker Green's Chicago office. At this time, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Bradley.
Hi, thank you everyone for dialing in today. So I've seen a lot of startups come up with an idea or have a general desire, sometimes just a group of physicians have a general desire to enter the telehealth, telemedicine field, but often those ideas change a lot during their engagement with us. So I thought a good thing would be, and certainly a way to save time and money, would be to provide some key considerations so that you can avoid some of the roadblocks and speed bumps that come up as you're talking through your concept with attorneys, and we're going to charge you for it. So if you can do this before you engage an attorney, hopefully you can have a clearer road to travel on. Adam, do you want to start on slide 7 now? So the first of the 5 considerations that I have is probably a very obvious one, and that is where are patients located? Obviously, you don't want to start a telehealth practice if you don't have patients who are going to utilize your product. But exactly what states you want to expand into, part of it's going to be your population, your patient population, but you're going to have a number of other factors to consider that we're going to address below. And so I have a couple of examples of different kinds of models that you should consider. If you're, let's say, a family practice that's using telehealth just for follow-up, then obviously you're not going to follow a 50-state model. You're looking at an in-state model and possibly expansion into 1 or 2 states, depending on whether your existing patients move and still want to see you through telemedicine, or they go off to college, or maybe you're close to a state line. And we'll actually talk about that issue when we get into the next slide on licensure. There are also regional models where, let's say you're an orthopedist and you partner with a physical therapist. So the people that are coming to you for the actual surgery that you're performing, obviously that is in your clinic. You can't do that yet through telemedicine. But you may have follow-up care that you can do remotely in several states. And you may have PT that's provided solely through telehealth to individuals in other states. And what are the requirements, what are the limitations that follow that kind of model? We'll talk about that, especially when we talk about corporate practice and medicine. There are climate-based models where, for example, you're a dermatologist and you have specialty in treating really bad sunburns. So you're not going to, you're probably not going to open up a practice in Maine. You're not going to look for patients there, but you may not choose to open your practice up to patients in Florida or California based on, regulatory concerns that we'll talk about later. And if you are, let's say, a psychiatrist who treats people generally, you could have a national model, but that could also be a disaster to open up from the get-go a 50-state model that you can't support financially, you can't keep up with your licensure in all of those states. So there are a number of things to consider. It's more than just your patient population, but I think that it's important to keep going back, keep thinking about your patient population as you develop your model. Slide. So the next factor is licensure. And with licensure, I just want clients to be aware of the different ways that licensure is addressed by the many states. It's more than just a full-blown license in every state. So you want to find out in what states can I practice through telehealth or telemedicine without any license at all. There are states that will allow you, up to 10 visits or something like that without anything. There's no licensure, there's no registration, you can just do it. And then there are variations of that. There are states where what you're doing will not require a license, especially if all you're doing is follow-up. If you're not actually providing any additional care and you're just following up with patients, in a lot of states, you won't be required to be licensed for just that purpose. There are a few states that have special telehealth or telemedicine registrations, which is going to be a lot less burdensome than a full-blown license. If you find that you have to have a license to practice in that state, you want to look at what I consider waiver. So can you quote-unquote waive into that state, meaning do you have the requisite experience and training so that you can apply for a license in that state without retaking examinations. And sometimes it's even a different application process that's less burdensome than getting a full-blown license. And then if you have to get a full-blown license, especially if you need a full-blown license in a few states, you want to look at whether those states are now or possibly are in the future going to join the multi-state compacts that are, I believe there's one for physicians, one primarily for physicians, but there are other compacts for NPs, for nursing, for physical therapy. I think there's one for chiropractic. So you just want to see what's out there and whether or not that would make your life a little easier, because if you use a compact, you're just basically applying once and then using that application in several states. Adam, next slide, please. The next factor that you want to consider is scope of practice. Now, if you are, let's say, a psychiatrist and you have no one working for you, you work out of your home office via telemedicine, and you want to keep it that way, scope of practice isn't going to matter very much for you. Scope of practice is going to be a consideration that you need to take when you have non-physician licensees working with or for you. So what can you delegate to those individuals? What can they do with their own license? How can you utilize something like a standing order to basically delegate down? And the big issue here is providing care through a non-physician, which is going to be cheaper. But you have to make sure that you can actually do that in the state where the patient is. So, for example, in DC, a nurse practitioner has independent authority. They have prescribing authority, they have treatment authority. But that same NP working in Virginia has to work under a collaboration agreement with a supervising physician. So if you start a telehealth practice in DC as an NP and you engage patients in Virginia, you have to engage those patients in accordance with a collaboration agreement with a supervising physician, which is certainly a lot more burdensome than in DC, but it's something that you need to research before you accept those patients. Other issues that may come up, even if, let's say, you are set up to be in compliance in Virginia, providing the same care in other states may not be permissible per their telehealth laws and regulations, because if they require you to follow to the letter their own regulations, they may have different regulations regarding the supervision that's required of the supervising physician. Do they have to be in the same location at all times? What kind of training do you have? Are there limitations on that particular non-physician licensee and their ability to provide the care that's being provided through your model? Those are all questions that you have to ask. Adam, next slide. And now we go to corporate practice. So for people that aren't familiar with corporate practice, it's simply a prohibition that some states follow on allowing usually a physician, but generally speaking it's a licensee or a professional, to be employed by a corporation. there's a huge variance between the states, not only in whether or not they adhere to a prohibition, but exactly what that means. So states like New York and California, which each have corporate practice of medicine prohibitions, they are both enforcing their own versions of those prohibitions, but the way that they enforce them are dramatically different. And it's not just medicine. You'll have states that have corporate practice of optometry, corporate practice of nursing, corporate practice of chiropractic. So it's kind of all over the board, and you have to look into those issues. And usually associated with corporate practice, but not necessarily, are other restrictions that you need to take into consideration, especially fee splitting and self-referral laws. And what I meant by not just these states, take, for instance, Florida, which does not have a corporate practice of medicine prohibition, but it has many different laws about referral and self-referral and fee splitting that you have to be really cognizant of when you're setting up your practice. And these are all things that, for the most part, you can engage legal counsel to, quote-unquote, fix along the way or to help you mold your practice correctly in accordance with those state laws. However, in terms of referral and self-referral, that's one issue that I would ask early on, because if your entire concept is using multiple licensees to provide a product, in some states that may be prohibited. For instance, a podiatrist and a physician in some states cannot form a professional corporation together. So, there may be a way to do it, but it may be so difficult that you just, it's not worth it. Adam, last slide, please. So the last factor, this is another one that may seem obvious, but hopefully I can give you some nuance. The last factor is really knowing what your product is. What makes you stand out? What makes you different? Is it the product itself? Is it a compounded product, a drug product, or is it a user experience? Is it the service that you're providing? You need to understand that in advance so that you can apply all these laws and see, does that work to provide it through telehealth, telemedicine? And I'll give you an example that we hear quite a bit. We often hear of physicians especially who think, using technology, I can provide a level of care that's still very good to patients at a much cheaper rate and in a much more convenient forum. And that sounds great. But let's say that your idea is fast and cheap primary care using store and forward technology. In some states, that's a great model. In some states, that's completely illegal. So when you go into a state like Michigan, if you don't have a pre-existing relationship with those patients, you can't form the relationship that you need to perform, primary care through store and forward. You have to create the relationship through two-way audio, visual, or both. So to me, that's a roadblock. You can't do it in Michigan. But just to give you an idea of what some of the speed bumps might be, well, if you're providing care through a non-physician licensee, making sure that scope of practice matches in those states, that they can provide the care that you want to provide in those states. Or if you're prescribing certain drugs remotely, making sure that you can do that in accordance with state and federal law. So those are the key considerations that I have. Thank you very much for joining me today. And as Adam said, please send me any questions that you might have or any comments on the slide deck. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining us. This concludes today's webinar. You're welcome to submit questions directly to today's presenter at bdavidson@ebglaw.com or via phone. In approximately 2 to 3 business days following the webinar, Epstein, Becker, and Green will communicate the availability of the webinar recording and access to the PowerPoint materials. Additionally, tune in again for the 3rd and final installment of the Telehealth Crash Course series on July 24th on Telehealth Portal Essentials. Thank you.